Anyway, we're going to walk for about 90 minutes. I do have to do the safety thing, which is we'll be crossing some roads, but we won't be going very fast. And ask any questions you want, take any pictures you want, and we won't go very fast. So hopefully we'll have a nice time. And I'll be picking on some people to tell me some history as well about the local area. Somebody grew up here. Tony grew up around.
Ne'er-do-well history.
Ne'er-do-well.
Yes,
Tony
sorry,
grew up
yes,
around here.
yeah.
So we're just going to cross the road. So yes, the building behind you is the entrance to the deep shelter, deep aerator. So before the Second World War, Mitchell, famous name if you know your railways, Mitchell was asked, who was the head of what was then Transport for London, to study if the tube network could be used as air raid shelters, because they'd seen the bombing in Spain, Guernica, and they knew, if we did have war with Germany, they would bomb our cities. And Mitchell famously turned around a report in about a fortnight that demonstrated how the tube network could be used as shelters. And again, famously, the British government did nothing to implement these recommendations. And then the Blitz starts, and they start work on some deep shelters here for the network. And basically what you have, if you can imagine, you have the Northern Line, and then beneath the Northern Line, running parallel, is another tunnel underneath the Northern. So that they started work in 1940, but because there was a shortage of manpower, people were fighting the war, there was a shortage of labour, and also TfL were told to pay for the tube itself, pay for it. There wasn't going to be the government there to pay for it. And it wasn't until 1942 that the actual tunnels were finished, by which point most of the Blitz had finished by that stage. They were used as for troops as well in 1943. And as you can see, they were enormous. And you could get up to 8,000 people could be in just one of these. And there's a whole series of them. So there's one here, there's one at Clapham Common, there's one Stockwell, Clapham North, and there's a couple in North London as well. And the idea was, they're just short sections underneath the platform, and the idea was that after the Second World War they could be connected, and there could be an express service from Merton underneath, the non-stopping connect. I mean, they never had the money to pay for it. And that was the idea of why they were built, like in sections along here, is so yeah, after the Second World War they could connect them all up and have connected to the service. Right. Then 1944 we get the rockets start landing, the V1s and then the V2s, and then they are actually used as shelters for civilians. Issued in tickets, you had a bunk to go on, you didn't turn up, the bunk went empty, it was very regulated, and then you had canteens and lavatories and medical posts underneath there, and the different areas were named after different admirals. Then, fast forward to the Second World War ends, 1948, and the British government, the Attlee government then, is introducing something called the British Citizenship Act, which extends the right to become a British citizen to anybody in the British dominions throughout the empire. Responding to that, the Windrush generation. So, ship leaves from Jamaica, and there was just under 500 predominantly young men, often ex-servicemen, coming from the Caribbean to work in this country, calling the call to the mother country. What's interesting, going back to Zachary Macaulay, his son Babington Macaulay was the guy who introduced throughout the empire in the Victorian period the whole concept of, basically, if you went to a school in India or the Caribbean, you were taught British history. So you were taught about Nelson, you were talked about Francis Drake and the others, and those young men were calling the call to the mother country due to the kind of the education they were had under the Macaulay system. In fact, there was a phrase, sons of Macaulay, who were more anglicised Indian. They knew more about British history than Indian history. Yeah, and they come to this country. Obviously, London was bombed out. There was a shortage of housing, and the young men from the Windrush generation were initially put in to the underneath here, and they were down in Clapham South too. They didn't stay there very long. They stayed there for about 2 weeks, a month before they were then rehoused somewhere else. And then one of the interesting stories is that because they were all finding work, and the nearest labour exchange was Cold Harbour Lane in Brixton, and that is the genesis of why Brixton gets its history.
This is a bit of an unusual video in that the walk here was done twice, once in the company of tour guide Dr. Stephen King in March, and once by myself alone in June. The weather on both occasions was identical, but this will explain why the trees keep gaining and shedding their leaves. In October 1837, a girl called Mary Stevens was walking to Lavender Hill, where she was working as a servant, after visiting her parents in Battersea. On her way over Clapham Common, a strange figure leapt at her from a dark alley. After immobilizing her with a tight grip of his arms, he began to kiss her face and touched her flesh with his claws, which were, according to her deposition, cold and clammy as those of a corpse. Mary screamed, making the attacker quickly flee from the scene. The commotion brought several residents who immediately launched a search for the aggressor, but he could not be found. The next day, the leaping character is said to have chosen a very different victim near Mary Stevens's home. He jumped in the way of a passing carriage, causing the coachman to lose control, crash, and severely injure himself. Several witnesses claimed that he escaped by jumping over a 9-foot-high wall while cackling with high-pitched laughter. Gradually, the news of the strange character spread, and soon the press and the public gave him the name Spring-Heeled Jack. Jane Alsop reported that on the night of the 19th of February 1838, she answered the door of her father's house to a man claiming to be a police officer, who told her to bring a light, claiming,
"We have caught Spring-Heeled Jack here in the lane."
She brought the person a candle and noticed that he wore a large cloak. The moment she had handed him the candle, he threw off the cloak and presented a most hideous and frightful appearance, vomiting blue and white flame from his mouth while his eyes resembled red balls of fire. Miss Alsop reported that he wore a large helmet and that his clothing, which appeared to be very tight-fitting, resembled white oilskin. She screamed for help and managed to get away from him and ran towards the house. She was rescued by one of her sisters, after which her assailant fled. This urban legend was very popular in its time, due to the tales of his bizarre appearance and ability to make extraordinary leaps. More sightings were reported all over the UK and were especially prevalent in suburban London. On the night of the 8th of February 1855, after a heavy snowfall in Devon, a series of hoof-like marks appeared in the snow. These footprints appeared in a single file, with the total distance of the tracks amounting to 40 miles. Houses, rivers, haystacks and other obstacles were travelled straight over. Footprints appeared on the tops of snow-covered roofs and high walls, which lay in the footprints' path, as well as leading up to and exiting drain pipes as small as 4 inches in diameter. These so-called devil's footprints were attributed to Spring-Heeled Jack. By the end of the 19th century, the reported sightings were moving towards the northwest of England. He was last seen in William Henry Street, Liverpool in 1904. Spring-Heeled Jack influenced many aspects of Victorian life, especially in contemporary popular culture. For decades, especially in London, his name was equated with the bogeyman, as a means of scaring children into behaving by telling them, if they were not good, Spring-Heeled Jack would leap up and peer in at them through their bedroom windows by night. And it all started here on Clapham Common.
Saved by Lottie Cunningham in 1997. And then underneath there is they've now put in storage for all the deck chairs, and so the deck chairs come out, and they now have bands playing. Have you been here for that?
Yeah, I have. I did see one. I was here last.
We stumbled across one, didn't we?
Yeah. Listen to the bands. Yeah. And then one of the musical relationships to that is this young man here, David Bowie, and that's him having a coffee at the.
Oh, I knew I felt good when I was there.
And there's the man himself, Brixton, South London, 1966. There he is. And this is why this area became what it is, because it became commuter land, and you could live in the countryside of Clapham, and the whole area would have been filled with very grand houses and enormous houses, in fact. And you could then become the governor of the Bank of England. We're going to visit Thornton's house. He was referred to as the second richest man in Europe, and he would have an enormous house there. And all around here would have been quite affluent. So if you ever go down between those two white buildings in there, it looks like Bath. It's beautiful. And there's a sign that says private road, and you can have a wander around, and it's absolutely lovely. And that's kind of and all around Clapham Common, there's kind of fragments of the grand houses that used to be around. This winter we have and summer, and that's because that is the last fragment of the enormous Thornton house that was here, and that is in orangery, and there would have been glass between the columns, and they would have grown oranges in there, and that was put up for the Thorntons. And if you have a look at this map here, so this we are standing. They're standing about here.
Yeah.
And so that would have been Thornton House. And this would have been their enormous garden. And there would have been a great big lake here. There are some pictures of the lake, and he would have entertained people like Queen Charlotte here, and people like that would have come here. William Pitt would have wandered in these beautiful gardens. Morrison, who was the Ken Livingstone of his day. And they were houses for poor people who had been bombed out. And interestingly enough, Herbert Morrison was accused of putting Labour voters in Clapham, and it was like gerrymandering, getting Labour voters into Tory Clapham. This is Notre Dame Estate. It's called the Notre Dame Estate because on the site was a now long gone grand house that we were referring to earlier. That got swept away, and that was a nunnery. London, you'll find these. I'd just like to point out, there was an MP called Samuel Gurney, who, late Victorian period, famously never said anything in Parliament. There's nothing in Hansard that he ever said anything when he was MP. But he was the driving force behind this, the Metropolitan Drinking Fountains Association. So basically, horses would drink out of this, and then round the side there's a cup for water, and humans would drink out of it. And they're all over London put in, and he's primarily only remembered for putting the drinking fountains in. But interesting enough, at the House of Commons at the time, there was a massive, loads of debate at the end of the 19th century, because they basically thought London was about to sink underneath horse manure, because horses were getting more and more, London was getting bigger, and there used to be a market where you'd scoop up the horse manure and then sell it to the market gardens. As the market gardens got further away from where the horses were, there was no market for selling the horse manure, and there was nobody picking it up. And so, like, the House of Commons was like we're going to sink under these stuff. There used to be orderly boys, and that was a name of a type of Victorian urchin who would scoop it up and carry it away. And they weren't economically viable. But then we invented the motor car and the tube system, and the problem just disappeared. But at one stage, we were convinced London was going to drown on.
In 1857, London was divided into 10 postal districts: EC, East Central; WC, West Central; North, North East, East, South East, South, South West, West and North West. The South and North East sectors were later abolished. But here in Clapham Common we have a residual sign from the defunct South District. There are just a few of these signs left from the South and North East postal areas. They only existed for 10 years between when Sir Rowland Hill devised the system in 1856 to its reorganisation in 1866. On the building to the right here we have a southwest sign for the pavement. This also was overtaken by events. During the First World War, the southwest and all the other postal areas were further subdivided and allocated numbers. The pavement now lies in Southwest 4.
I've been a temptress too long.
Prostate cancer is a risk factor for men, and it is essential to prioritise regular checkups to detect the condition early. Early detection significantly improves the chances of successful treatment and higher survival rates. By understanding risk factors and following recommended screening guidelines, men can take proactive steps to protect their prostate health. Use the QR code to find out more.